Welcome back to the Sound of Science. Today, we are going to be talking about ecology, which is essentially the study of the interactions that take place between organisms and where they live. And an important thing for you to remember about ecology is that it really is about relationships, the relationships that occur between organisms and non living things, relationships that occur between organisms and other organisms, and how those relationships affect life on our planet. So keep that in the back of your head as we move through here, that it's really all about relationships. Everything is connected. Habitat and niche are two of those words that I wanted to define right off the bat. Habitat is where an animal lives, right? It's the kind of environment that it needs to be found in. A niche is everything, including the habitat. What does it do? What resources does it need? What resources does it use? All of those things are part of an organism's niche. Another term I wanted to define explicitly for you is abiotic. Now, A usually means not, bio means living. So, abiotic means something that's non living. There are so many non living factors in an organism's environment. For example, things like temperature, water, soil, light, air currents, wind. All of these things, including sun, are abiotic factors, but without them, there would be no life on our planet. Organisms would not be able to survive. So, abiotic factors are something that biologists may continue to study, even though primarily biologists are focused on living things. The opposite side of that are the biotic factors. These are all the living things found in a specific area or in an environment. Organisms depend on each other, and it can be directly and it can be indirectly. They need food, they need shelter, they need other organisms for reproduction, they sometimes need protection. All of these things sort of play a role in organisms and their life, and it's all part of their niche. Back in the beginning of this semester, we talked about levels of organization for living things. And we started off by talking about atoms and how atoms came together to make molecules, and molecules came together to make organelles. Those are the parts inside the cell, right? Cells come together to make tissues, tissues come together to make organs, organs come together for organ systems, and organ systems, a whole bunch of them together, make up an organism. So that is all the little stuff and the building up to that organism, that one individual. But the thing is, these are just the simplest letter levels. From this point, we're going to start talking about those relationships outside of the organism. So that's what we're seeing here. So an organism obviously is an individual living thing, but if you get a group of the same species together, we're going to call that a population. The populations of different species in an area make a biological community. And please remember, we're not just talking about the animals in an area. We're talking about the plants, the fungi, the bacteria. All of those are part of the biological community. An ecosystem is when we take all of those living things and we put them together with the non-living things in the area as well. From ecosystem together become the biosphere. So obviously, a population are organisms that all belong to the same species. These are a group of organisms that are very similar, that are able to reproduce and produce fertile offspring. That's just taking the definition of species and sort of applying it into the definition of populations. Part of what we look at with populations are population densities. This is how many organisms live per unit of area. That can be of land or of water. So the example that I've given you here is an area that's 1 kilometer by 2 kilometers. So that is going to be, if you multiply 2 by 1, you get 2 kilometers squared. If we look at the purple diamond organisms that live there. There's 8 of them. So there's 8 per 2 kilometers squared. We divide that out. That means we have 4 diamonds per kilometer squared. That's a population density. And a lot of times we can determine how healthy an environment is by that population density or by how many organisms are in a population. We also might use population density to determine how many organisms there are in the population. So let's say that we don't want to count how many of a specific organism exist in a 200 square kilometer area, but we can count how many are in 1 kilometer or how many are in a meter squared. We can then take that and we can multiply it up to the total area, giving us the total population. More demographics to be interested in, and again, demographics are just the population statistics, are the types of growth that the population is experiencing. So exponential growth means that organisms are reproducing at a constant rate. They're growing exponentially. Logistical growth is what happens after you have a period of exponential growth. So let's say that a species moves into an area. It takes a while for the population to reach a point where it's going to start to level off and the growth will slow down. This typically is what's going to happen when we're starting to reach the maximum number of that particular species that an area can support. We're going to call that the carrying capacity, and you're going to see that on one of the upcoming slides. Immigration and emigration sound pretty similar, but they're actually the opposite of each other. Immigration with an I means that organisms are moving in to a population. Also starts with an I. Immigration means that organisms are moving out of the population or they're going to exit the population. So immigration with an E stands for exiting the population. Immigration with an I stands for moving into a population. Okay, so here is what this is going to look like in a graph form. So the carrying capacity is the largest number of individuals in a population that the environment can support. And that number is determined by whatever the limiting factors are. Limiting factors can be biotic, they can be abiotic, so living or not living. They are typically going to be things that organisms need: food, water, space, or it could be something that keeps the population from getting any bigger, like predation, the number of mates that are possible. So those things can control how big the population is going to be. So what you're seeing on this graph, and I'm going to suggest to you right now that you really need to write down all of these definitions and you really need to sketch out this graph in your notes. The population growth, we can actually see that the independent variable here is actually time. Population growth is our dependent variable. It's responding. And so if there are unlimited resources in our population or in our area, you're going to see that fast growth, that exponential growth would continue. But because we have factors that limit the size of the population, eventually that fast growth is going to slow down and we're going to reach a stable state or a stable equilibrium. As you see here, this is just an example of what a population growth curve might look like. So we start off down here, we're looking at days instead of looking at years, which is fine. We can do that. And our population starts off pretty low, right? Right at 0. As we see over time, the population starts to increases slowly at first, and then the population gets very large very fast. This section right here is referred to as the J curve. This is our exponential growth. Because our growth levels off and starts to slow down, this whole curve is referred to as the S curve. So J curve means exponential growth. S curve indicates what we would refer to as logistic growth. And that's just because it indicates that we have some type of limiting factors here. And again, remember those limiting factors could be things like disease, food, space, mates, predators, anything that keeps the population smaller. This line right here, that is a nice and stable segment where our population stays the same going forward. This line is our carrying capacity. So if we move straight across or as straight across as we can see what our carrying capacity would be. In this case, our carrying capacity is right around 2,000. So that's the maximum number of organisms in this species that can survive in this area. Let's talk about different types of organisms. So we have producers or we have consumers, and producers are going to be things like autotrophs. There are plants, there are protists, there are bacteria that fall under this producer category. These are organisms that are going to be making their own food. And this doesn't mean like they go to the kitchen and they make a sandwich. This means they can actually take energy from the sun to help create their own food, or it could mean that they're going to be able to take chemicals, break them apart, and use that to create energy. These guys are going to be the bottom of the food chain. This is where energy actually enters into our ecosystems through the sun or through whatever method. Consumers are our heterotrophs. These are organisms that are eating producers or eating each other, eating other consumers. And we refer to these guys as either herbivores if they're eating plants and producers, carnivores if they're eating other consumers, omnivores if they're eating both, and decomposers if they're not really consuming anything. Instead, they're just breaking down dead things. Think fungi, bacteria are fantastic decomposers. Okay, finally, we've made it to symbiotic relationships. I have hinted about these types of relationships all year. You guys know what symbiotic relationships are, but now we're going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. So, a symbiotic relationship is any relationship between two organisms where they are working together or they're living together closely whether they want to or not. And symbiotic relationships can be broken down into different types. First of all, we talk about commensalism. Commensalism is when one organism benefits from the relationship. The other organism is just kind of like, it is what it is. They don't really care one way or another. Best example of this are the shark and the remora. The remora is this little fish. You can actually see it in the picture below that of the shark. And the remora are the little fish that sort of hang out with the sharks, and they sometimes sort of suction themselves to the sharks and they hang out with them. And really, the whole idea is that the shark really doesn't care that the remoras are there, but the remoras get to eat the leftovers because sharks are notoriously messy eaters. The shark's not harmed by the remora being there, but the remora gets a benefit from hanging out with the shark. Parasitism is different. Parasitism is when one species is going to benefit and the other is harmed. You guys know what parasites are: ticks, leeches, fleas, tapeworms, any type of intestinal worm, even. These are all types of parasites and they harm their host. Mutualism is when both species are going to benefit. So these are things like cleaner shrimp that clean up fish or larger organisms, cleaning birds. These are the ones that pick the little food bits out of the crocodile's mouths. Lichen that work together, or mycorrhiza, which are these fungal extensions off of plant roots, and the plant and the fungus work together to survive, very similar to what we see with lichen. So mutualism both species are happy to be in the relationship. Parasitism is more like a toxic relationship where one individual's like, yeah, I got to get out of here. And the other one's like, no, 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 stay forever. And then commensalism is when, just one organism is like, you're the best ever. And the other one's like, I don't even know your name. So, symbiotic relationships. Make sure you write these down. Make sure you know what each of the three symbiotic relationships are. And maybe write down some of the examples. When you were young, you were probably taught all about food chains, right? And it was probably something very simplistic, like here's the grass, it gets eaten by a grasshopper, the grasshopper gets eaten by a bird. That's a food chain. It's actually a perfectly acceptable food chain. In this case, we're going to give some new names to these different levels of the food chain, and you need to know these names and you need to understand what they mean. Producers are going to be organisms that are capable of taking energy from another source, like the sun, trapping them and creating food. So algae are producers in this particular food chain. Producers are going to be eaten by what we refer to as a first order or a primary consumer. Primary consumers are always going to be like a herbivore. Secondary consumers will eat primary consumers. So these guys are going to be a little bit larger, a little bit higher up on the food chain. Secondary consumers are going to be eaten by tertiary or third order consumers, and tertiary consumers are going to be eaten by quaternary consumers. It can continue from there, but usually a quaternary consumer is sort of the point where we're going to stop. One of the most important things that I can point out, though, about these food chains is that the arrows indicate the flow of energy. So these algae that are taking in energy from the sun actually have the most energy in this particular food chain. And as we move through each level of the food chain, we refer to those as trophic levels, we're actually going to be losing energy. But that's the direction that the energy moves. And of course, after you learn about the food chain, you have to move to the more complicated version, which is the food web. So here at the bottom, this is our producer level. These are the organisms that are going to be taking in energy from primarily the sun and using that energy to support the rest of the food web. These organisms are going to be consuming our producers. So these organisms here we would refer to as primary consumers. Okay? So all of these guys that I've underlined are primary consumers. Now, anything that eats a primary consumer, we would refer to as a secondary consumer. In this case, like the bald eagle is a secondary consumer. The marsh hawk is a secondary consumer. Rat is going to be a secondary consumer. But I want to point out something really interesting. The herring is also a secondary consumer. It's both. That's because the herring in this case is an omnivore. It's eating both vegetation and it's eating insects and other organisms. And the killer whale is also going to be a tertiary consumer and a quaternary consumer. So you see, as we move up, energy is flowing in the direction of the arrows. So in this case, the energy from the vegetation is flowing into the herring, which is a fish, and the herring's energy is flowing into the bald eagle. There are a couple of other things that I wanted to point out on these as well. These guys that are at the very top, that nothing is eating. So this killer whale, there's nothing eating the killer whale. There's nothing eating the bald eagle. There's nothing eating the marsh hawk. These are what we would refer to as an apex predator. These guys are at the top of their food chain. So as you go through this, you don't need to write all of this down, but it is important that you sort of understand how to read one of these food webs and you can get information from it. For instance, if I were to ask you, is there a primary consumer on this chart? You should be able to pick one of those out. Primary consumer, these are organisms that are eating vegetation. So here, 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 all of those are going to be primary consumers. As we move energy between trophic levels, we're going to lose it. Actually, we're going to lose a lot of it. And that was something that I mentioned earlier in this video. So the energy is lost to the cost of daily living, right? Some of it's going to be lost as waste. Some of it's going to be lost in processes. Some of it's going to be lost in movement, energy needs. And some is going to become part of the organism itself. That's the energy that can be passed to the next trophic level. Let me explain what I mean. On this pyramid, you can see where each trophic level is. So producers at the bottom, there's the most of them. They have the most energy and they have the largest biomass. That just means the amount of mass of living organisms at that level. Primary consumers are the second highest, but between the energy the energy in the producers' bodies and the energy in the primary consumers' bodies is a 90% loss. We lose about 90% of our energy to our processes and to just living life. So these bunnies have a certain amount of energy in their bodies, but it's only 10% of the energy that they have taken in. The other 90% was lost to bunnies doing bunny things. So then, as they pass on to the secondary consumers, we see that they're only keeping about 10% of the energy they take in. Tertiary consumers are only keeping about 10% of what they're taking in. So, what does all of this mean? Well, this means that if I started out with 1,000 kilograms of mass or calories of energy on this level, then this level is only going to retain 100 of those calories. That means this level only retains 10 of those calories because the other 90 are lost. And this level is only going to retain 1 of those calories. So for every calorie that a tertiary consumer needs or becomes part of the tertiary consumer's body, we have to have 1,000 calories of energy available at the producer level. This also means that for every 1 kilogram of tertiary consumer we need 1,000 kilograms of producers to support it. This is why it's a pyramid. This is why the base is so much wider. There's always going to be vastly more producers and energy tied up in producers than we're going to find as we move up to the highest trophic levels. This is also why there's so few predators or apex predators compared to the other consumers. If we end up with too many predators, there won't be enough energy or not enough biomass to support them, and we'll actually end up with potentially extinction events. Doing a great job hanging in with this video. Succession is what happens in an area over time. And essentially, we know the order of events that are going to occur as an area is recovering from some type of catastrophe. So, for instance, secondary succession literally is what occurs after something like a flood or a mudslide or a forest fire. Leaves behind soil, and we know the order of species that move into that area. Same thing with primary succession, except primary succession is starting in an area that's completely lifeless. No soil, no other organisms, nothing is there. Primary succession is where we're going to see pioneer species, things like lichen and mosses moving in, organisms that can live without a whole lot of soil. Climax community, that's what we call the very end. That's when we reach our stable state. Here you can see what I'm talking about. So this is primary succession occurring over hundreds of years. Succession takes a long time. When we start off with this particular level of succession or this particular instance of succession, we have bare rock. There's nothing there. There's no soil. Maybe there was a volcanic eruption, or maybe there was a glacier that melted and receded. We're actually getting lots of that right now. And the bare rock under it is revealed. Well, that first thing that's going to happen are the pioneer stages, where the pioneer species move in. So things like lichen are going to move in and they're going to start growing on that rock. Lichen are actually going to use their little um, fungal hyphae to break apart the rocks that it's growing on. That broken down rock and the dead lichen bodies, because eventually they die after a while, that is actually going to start producing the first soil. After a while, we're going to start to get things like grasses, um, mosses. These are plants that don't require a ton of soil in order to survive. And then over time, eventually, we're going to get things like shrubs. We're going to get some of these what they call shade intolerant trees. Typically, what they mean are like pine trees, trees that grow really super fast. And then ultimately, we'll end up with the more shade tolerant trees like the hardwood trees, oak trees, maple trees. Um, and that's assuming that that's what the climax community will be in this area. This is the pattern that's going to occur every time. And just don't forget, the only difference between primary and secondary succession is that primary succession starts with bare rock. Secondary succession is going to start after there's soil already there. Okay, so what did I mean by climax community? Well, climax community is what type of environment, what type of plants are supposed to be in an area based on where that area is. Biomes are really what we're kind of getting at here. So we actually have several different types of biomes. Nobody really agrees on the number of biomes we should have. We're really going to talk about 6 of them, but I wanted to point out that when we're talking biomes, one of the really cool things we see is that biomes occur in layers. So we're going to find certain biomes kind of around the equator. And then as we move further away from the equator, we get biomes that tend to be colder. We see them in these bands. And that's why I have a picture of this map up here for you. Okay, here are the 6 main terrestrial biomes. Terrestrial just means on land, okay? We also are going to have marine, which is saltwater, and freshwater biomes as well. They're pretty self-explanatory. And I just have this so you can really just kind of see the difference. So rainforest, most rainfall typically are going to be very, very tropical, very warm. There is a type of rainforest called a temperate rainforest. It's found in very few places in the world, but it has high rainfall with more normal temperatures. Um, deciduous forest. A deciduous forest is it's us. It's where we live. We live in Virginia, and Virginia is all deciduous forest. This is going to have trees that lose their leaves in the fall, like oak trees or maple trees. Um, the taiga or boreal forest, this is the type of forest that we see a lot in Canada or in the northern US. We see taiga. This is going to have a lot of those evergreen trees. It's going to tend to be a little bit colder. It's definitely it's more harsh climate. Tundra is going to be completely frozen. This is going to get the least amount of rainfall along with deserts. Deserts and tundra actually get the same amount of precipitation each year. When we say rainfall, we don't mean like only rain, we're including snowfall in that as well. But they get the lowest amount, whereas the grasslands and the taiga actually get a similar amount of precipitation as well. Main difference there is taiga's got trees, grasslands, not so much, not very many trees. It's mostly grasses, as you can tell by the name. But the desert and the tundra are almost like opposites of each other, except that they have the same rainfall. Deserts tend to be a lot warmer. Tundra tends to stay frozen, at least a portion of the soil all year long. Okay, so now we've finally gotten ourselves to the cycles. I am not going into detail on these cycles. In this case, the water cycle, you guys have been learning the water cycle since you were in like second grade. The water cycle is made up of basically a cycle of evaporation, or transpiration, which is evaporation out of plants, condensation, and precipitation. And we see it repeat itself over and over again. And there's a couple of other words that have been thrown in here for you, but you know the water cycle. You may want to sketch out this a little bit, just to sort of help you as we move through. Okay, carbon cycle. Again, the carbon cycle is a little bit more complicated. We've actually talked about it already, but essentially, the carbon cycle is the way that carbon is going to move through the environment and through the organisms in there, and this is primarily driven by cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Now, we have to include things like burning of fossil fuels, which also releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but so does cellular respiration. So these animals here are releasing carbon into the environment, which is then going to be absorbed by the trees, the plants, the algae, the bacteria that's photosynthetic. It's going to absorb that carbon dioxide, do photosynthesis, and release oxygen. That's the main part of this cycle, is the carbon dioxide is breathed out and taken in by plants. Plants are going to do photosynthesis. They're going to release oxygen, which can be taken in by these animals that are going to start the process all over again. Final cycle is the nitrogen cycle. Most important thing for you to remember the nitrogen cycle. We are surrounded by nitrogen. That nitrogen in the air we can't use. And so bacteria living in the soil is actually nitrogen fixing. Some bacterias, not all of them, but they actually live on the nodules, in these nodules of plant roots, through denitrifying bacteria, or through a process called nitrification. It's going to bounce back and forth. So nitrification occurs. You have nitrifying bacteria, and then eventually you end up with denitrification, and denitrifying bacteria. And they're going to back into the atmosphere, where it once again has to be fixed by nitrogen fixation. So, what's the main part of this cycle? The main part of this cycle is that nitrogen in the atmosphere can't be used. It's fixed by bacteria. We consume it. We then go through decomposition, or our waste gets decomposed. That nitrogen is going to go through several stages before it's returned to the atmosphere, where it's going to be taken back in by those nitrogen fixing bacteria. So this has brought us to the end of this particular video. I know it's been long. I hope you guys have gotten lots of great information about it. And as always, I'll see you next time here on The Sound of Science.